So I'd like to start off this video by saying that the format of these videos is going to change, whereas in the previous, original versus remake videos that I've done, I started off by saying here's what the old did better and then here's what the new did better. And I'm going to quit doing that because it makes the outcome a little too obvious. Like, if I name a whole bunch of things that the old version did better, then it's going to be obvious that that version wins. If I only name like one or two things, if that, then, money is on the remake. But essentially I'm going to do it a little more in the style of Doug Walker's Old versus New series, where I talk about each point that both movies have in common and kind of weigh them against each other. I'm not going to end each point by saying that the old version did it better or the new version did it better either, because honestly that would get a little too repetitive. I'm simply going to weigh them against each other once again. In some cases it is going to be plainly obvious which version I'm leaning towards, but I'm going to give my final thoughts at the end of each video from now on. And originally, the reason I wanted to just start off with the old and then go on to what the new version did better was because I didn't want it to resemble the Nostalgia Critic's Old versus New series that much. But honestly, there's a reason why he uses that formula, and that's because that formula works. And with that, here is my comparison between 2005's House of Wax and 1979's Tourist Trap. Tourist Trap? What the hell is that? Well, when House of Wax was originally being scripted, it was intended to be a remake of Tourist Trap originally. But then, the studio execs noticed that it had something to do with the wax museum, and they were like, well, nobody knows about Tourist Trap or even gives a shit about it. Let's just attach it to that old Vincent Price movie and then make enough changes to it so that it doesn't even resemble Tourist Trap. But we're not going to make it anything like House of Wax either. Why would we do that? Come on. And yeah, they did make some pretty drastic changes in House of Wax so that even if they had called it Tourist Trap, just as a remake, it would have been dead on arrival because people would have still been comparing it to this movie that differs from so much. However, it still holds more in common with Tourist Trap than it does with the film that it was actually named after. Here's the synopsis for Tourist Trap for those of you who have never seen it or even heard of it. There's a group of friends who are driving somewhere when something happens to their vehicle, and they seek help from this guy who's running a little wax museum type of thing. And as they're checking out some of the statues, they find that one of them seems so lifelike that it might actually be a real body, and then they find themselves to be the targets of this killer wearing a mask made out of wax and who has some serious issues with sibling rivalry. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So with that out of the way, let's start comparing what these two films have in common. First of all, there are the sets. Both of them take place in this sort of family-run wax museum type of thing. In the original, it's about as much of a full-fledged museum as Captain Spaulding's Museum of Monsters and Madmen from House of a Thousand Corpses. That being said, it doesn't make it any less interesting to look at. The statues in the film are very creepy to look at. It even includes a few mannequins, which lead to some really creepy scenes, and some of the wax figures are even mechanical so that they can move around and even attack the characters a few times. It is some pretty cool stuff. Also, I found some of the sets in House of Wax to be fairly interesting. For one thing, it's actually kind of cool that they made the titular House of Wax actually made of wax, and it's a pretty creepy and unique concept that they rigged the entire town to be this big elaborate wax museum. Although there are some creative decisions that went into this that I find kind of questionable, to be honest. Like, for one thing, there's this reveal in the film, which isn't much of a reveal, where it turns out that it was originally intended for this whole town to be a tourist attraction. Visit Trudy's Town of Wax. If that's the case, why would they put a house of wax in the Town of Wax? That would be kind of like if Captain Spaulding had a room of monsters and madmen inside his museum of monsters and madmen. It it doesn't make any sense. And even in that case, you know, they could have at least made the House of Wax more like a classic wax museum where it contains figures of more famous people. In that sense, they could have at least attempted to make it somewhat resembling of House of Wax. It would have even resembled Tourist Trap a little more because even the place in that movie included some historical figures like General Custer. Next, let's talk about the general cast of characters from both films. These movies don't really have any characters in common when it comes to the antagonists. In Tourist Trap, throughout most of the running time, you're just following three women and one guy. And the reason I say most of the running time is because, you know, since it is a slasher film, some of them get knocked down along the way. And in the case of the women, any one of those three characters could have been swapped out in any given scenario and it wouldn't have made a difference because they don't really they don't really have distinct enough personalities or character traits to make them, you know, really stand out as characters. As far as they go, the only thing I can remember is how nice they were to look at, especially this one in particular, who, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that she's played by the same actress who played Midge on That 70s Show. And then, as for the guy character, the only moment with him, well, there are a couple of moments that I can remember with him. For one thing, there's this scene where he's gnawing through these ropes that are keeping him bound, and you can see the blood in his teeth and everything. And it's pretty fucking intense to watch. And then, a little bit later, there's a scene where he's in the killer's house, and he sees this guy with the, you know, wax mask on coming after him, and without even a moment's hesitation, the dude just jumps out a window, actually through a window. He breaks the glass and everything. Like, he just says, fuck this shit, I'm out of here. I don't care if that's not a door, I'm making it one. Now, House of Wax does not feature the most likable or even original of characters. You've got the main character's boyfriend, who's kind of a tool. There's this drunk idiot in the group, and then there's this vaguely slutty woman being played by one of the worst actresses in history. But at least each character has something about them that makes them stand out from the rest of the group. At least I could tell the difference between each of the characters. And I also kind of liked how they had more of a sense of humor in A House of Wax. Even to this day, there are a few moments in this film that get a good laugh out of me. Now, at the beginning of the video, I said that they made certain changes to House of Wax which made it so wildly different from Tourist Trap that it wouldn't have even worked if it had been named after that movie. And the key thing which makes House of Wax not a Tourist Trap movie is the actual murder scenes. Now, in House of Wax, the masked killer uses all of these sharp weapons to dispatch of his victims, and I have to admit some of the scenes were genuinely effective and cool to watch. Like, there's this one shot that involved a decapitation that I thought was really cool to watch, and then one scene which wasn't actually a kill scene but just a gore scene, which I find pretty effective, is this one involving all of these rotting animal carcasses. That is easily one of the most disgusting, disturbing, and suspenseful moments I've seen in a movie. Although it does lack realism, if that had actually happened, somebody would have thrown up at some point. However, House of Wax does arguably have more realistic killing scenes than Tourist Trap, because whereas the masked killer in that movie uses his hands to handle these sharp instruments, the killer in Tourist Trap uses his mind. He actually has these telekinetic powers that he uses to manipulate a lot of objects. And he doesn't even do it quickly, where he just, there's a knife laying somewhere and he just uses his mind to make it, fly into someone's chest. He makes a show out of the whole thing. He manipulates the wax figures and dummies and department store mannequins that he has laying around to fuck with his victims' minds as much as possible and just scare the living shit out of them before he finally puts them out of their misery. Now, I don't know if I've already mentioned this, but if I have, I'll say it again. If you have a fear of mannequins or dummies, don't watch Tourist Trap. And now on to our final point, which these two films have in common, and that is the killer with the mask of wax. Now, the killer from Tourist Trap is scary as hell. If you saw this guy coming after you, even in like a slow lurching motion, and there was no door or even window for you to go through, you would make a new door through the fucking wall. He is that scary. Honestly, I couldn't blame the guy for, going through the window like he did. And he's, not just scary to look at, but even menacing on a psychological level. He has this split personality and identity crisis going on. And there's a scene near the end of the film which is pretty disturbing on, just a psychological level once again. However, it does lead to this exposition about his backstory, which was completely unnecessary. But with all that going on, he still manages to have a sense of humor about what he's doing. He knows that what he's doing is bad, and he has a great time doing it. There's even one scene in the film where he doesn't share any screen time with any of the other actors. It's just him in a room with one of his dummies, and it's creepy as hell, but it's also kind of funny to watch. Now, the killer from House of Wax is pretty scary as well. If he was coming after me, if I had the time to fucking do it, I would make a hole through the wall. But he doesn't have any real personality to speak of. He's kind of like a Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees character who just, when he sees a person, he kills them. And he's kind of generic in that way. Moving on. So, in the end, this is going to be yet another case where the horror movie is as good as its monster or villain, and for that reason, I choose Tourist Trap as the better film between the two. I love how the killer is able to terrify me, but also make me laugh. And again, for the fact that he has this abilities which don't necessarily make him unique to the horror genre. Carrie could do that stuff too. But it does make him feel fresh to the body count slasher genre. And going back to 2005's House of Wax, do I think it's a great movie? No. But I honestly don't think it's god-awful. Even though it is a guilty pleasure of mine, I don't feel the slightest bit of shame when I say that I like this movie. I still find it just as thoroughly entertaining as I did when I was a teenager. So if you haven't seen that movie yet, and you're interested in seeing a gory, so bad it's good kind of slasher movie, I'd recommend giving it a shot. Just don't compare it to Tourist Trap, and especially don't compare it to House of Wax. If you try to hold a Paris Hilton movie up to the standards of a Vincent Price movie, it almost made me physically sick just saying that, but if you try doing that, you're going to have a bad time. Anyway, that's all I've got to say for this comparison. As always, I hope y'all have a good one.